the idea is I do a little introduction, and then we have like 4 actors speaking about their figures, and the way we're doing it is the first actor is Christo. He'll speak only about one figure. The second one will speak about 2 figures, and the other 2 about 3 figures. And why is that? Because then you can see the difference between, let's say, the internal structure of a figure and the connections between figures, right? So the question is really, what is a figure? And the other is, can you actually map it? And when you map it, when you map several ones, do they actually form a larger map? Right, so that there's multiple questions. So there will be a lot of issues about how we actually map figures, how we construct them, and the other is, does it actually form some kind of surface? You know, of course, we put them on a surface. We call it on the whiteboard of Miro, which is an interesting tool. But is it like Miro itself decides to like create things as like atlases? Or is there an inherent system to the figures that allows them to be mapped onto a 2-dimensional surface? Or is this 2-dimensional surface so torn that you can actually restitch all the parts and that it will form a sphere or a planet, right? So those are big questions. Let me just make a small introduction, Vera, because you've probably haven't seen what we've been doing. First, there's the 5 postures. There's the whole idea of the postures. I think the difference between, let's say, the seminar and the Grace and Gravity book is that now we concentrate much more on the notion of the figure than on the notion of grace itself. Though there are many overlappings, because of course the statement of the book is that grace works with figures, and so in this case, especially postural figures, sometimes it's even called postural realism. I think in the 5th chapter or something, right? So we're talking about postures, and we have 5 postures, and I never understood why I came up with 5 until like the 10th session or something, and I think it works like this. Standing is in the middle, and then we get 2 axes. One is a gravitational axis, and the other is a sort of anti-grav. What actually Heinrich von Kleist calls antigrav, an anti-gravitational axis. So the gravitational one is falling, which I still have to record, by the way, falling and hanging, and then on the horizontal we have floating and jumping. Right, so there is a systemacy here, thank God. Right, so it's actually good news that there are 5 postural structures or 5 postural figures. Now, why standing in the middle? Well, that's very clear from the introduction, I hope, and also the lecture on standing, that it is a form of realism, but it is a really awkward form of realism in the sense that it immediately tries to absorb appearances. So it tries to understand entities, but entities as such a way as ungrounded. And I think that's important to say, because the word existence means standing forth, literally, and it's family of words like insistence and assistance and resistance, all those words, that deal with standing. So standing is the main figure. It's just that there's no ground. So normally the usual theories of figure always speak about figure and ground, as we know from Gestalt theory. In this case, these figures deal with each other, and figures deal with other figures, and they don't deal with the ground, but they do deal with gravity. I think that's important to say. So they're groundless. It's a form of groundless standing. But it doesn't mean that it's not doubled. It has to hold itself, so to speak. This is a form of bootstrapping. So there's still a doubling of the figure. While it's holding itself, that already means there's a loop going on. And this loop I've called a chiastic structure. So and chiastic really means it has a very complex form of symmetry. A very complex form of symmetry. And I think in that sense, gravity that's very nice in English, but we see it in Dutch as well, and I guess in French too, is that you can say like we carry ourselves, right? So a form of behavior or a form of postural behavior or a form of manner, we can actually call to carry ourselves, right? And you have the same in French and probably in English with comportment. But I know from Dutch gedrag and dragen, right? The carrying, actually quite literally the same. And I think the homonym in English of way and a way as a road, right? A way as a form of weighing mass, and at the same time weighing as a movement over a road. Hi, Rick. There's Rick. I will introduce you guys later. So I'm now like introducing the whole set of the structure of the seminar, and then like get to the notion of the figure. But we talk about carrying ourselves. The other thing is like when figures communicate with each other, they also carry things over. They carry themselves over. So there's also a sense of metaphor. So what do we have? We have chiastic structures of figures themselves, that actually sort of deal with their own holding as a form of stance. So that brings us to that notion of the contrapposto, that it's always a double figure, a chiastic structure. But while it meets others, there's a carrying over. So there's this sense of metaphor. So the weight is important, gravity is important, but it's not this sort of generalizing structure that puts us on a planet and relates us to a ground. So it's not a figure-ground relationship. It's really figures and how they behave and how they act. Now, this notion of a figure being mobile, of a figure being conducting or carrying itself, is you would say, well, then it travels over a map, right? You would have a map or some kind of landscape, and then it travels over that. I don't think that's what we've been doing. We've been looking at territories as figures as territories. They do sort of extend, and they do sort of occupy a certain amount of area. But they're, on the other hand, they're also loose. So in that sense, they're territories, but they're detached territories. I wouldn't say deterritorialized, but they're actually detached. They're free to meet others, but they're very territorial about what they are. So let's see what that means. If we look at the figures, I'm not going to share the Miro board directly with you because the four actors are going to do that for us. But if you look at the figures later, you will see there's something quite specific going on. We use both images as well as graphic tools. And these graphic tools are very diagrammatic. They're axes, you will see arrows, you will see dashed lines, you will see sometimes words that are very operative words. So you'll see something of diagram in all of those, but you also see loads of images. And so that brings a certain set of issues to the fore. One is that do the figures actually have a form? The other is, if they have a form and a structure, can we speak about structure in the way that architects or engineers would do, or is it much more a way of how you would structure mobility, like an engine or a mechanical structure? So can we actually look at these as machines that you can put on and off, or that put themselves on and off? So while they do that, they mobilize their images. And I think that's the way we construct the figures. You will see series of images that are structured by axes. And there's many, many different types. We get horizontal axes that are singular, that just divide in like an above and an under. You will see some of these axes actually have names at the poles. You will see T-shaped axes that are like two double axes. You will see double horizontals. You will actually see looping constructions, and you will see a lot of crosses. Now these crosses, we have one or two fourfolds, But what's interesting, we got a bunch of crosses as well, and it's not that it's a Christian argument, but we've looked at sort of the Christian crosses, and it's quite stunning to see that some of these actually form Greek crosses. We'll see Latin crosses. We see actually crosses like thicken at the ends, getting sidebars like what we call a cross potent. So we get a lot of structure internally to these systems. The question, though, is like, how does that structure relate to the images it's deploying? And you will see that these images are sometimes singular, sometimes they're series or variations, sometimes these variations actually organized in a little matrix. So there's a lot of types of images that are being structured by these actual systems. So I think that's quite important to say. And so we have form and we have machine. Another thing is character. Of course, the word character also often relates to the notion of figure, but in this case, it's really each figure brings in a specific mood. I think that's also important to say. So they act, they travel, they meet, they have relationships of mimesis. They have, you will see that they often have limb-like constructs. But they also bring in a certain type of mood. Some are very aggressive, others are very deceptive, others are very sweet. So there's a whole range of moods and emotions that are involved in the characters. So there's also a question of how they would meet and how we would meet them. So I think for the event, it's important that to say, like, how do we actually structure this event? We'll have the actor speaking and showing their figure or figures and making short statements, and then we go immediately to the crits, right? So you can immediately sort of ventilate ideas or criticisms, or expand on the ideas that actors are bringing in. We do that 4 times. So my expectancy is that we will actually have like the discussion will grow larger and larger and become more comprehensive. I also would like to sort of see a number of questions answered. It's like not only what is a figure in relationship to a mechanics or a machinery. I would also like to know something about what kind of mapping is this? Can we call it a board? Can we actually call it an atlas? Is it more like a chart? What kind of name would it have to have? And can it be expanded? And if so, and what type of expansion would we need to think about? Right. So these are the major questions. Now, what I'm going to do now is introduce everybody. That is the 3 crits. And then we're going to start. So we have Vera Bühlmann in Vienna. She's a professor of architecture theory, and she with her ATTP, architecture theory, and the theory of the theory of the technology of philosophy. What was the philosophy of technology? ATTP has a load of videos on the YouTube channel. Really fantastic work. It's really important for everybody who's here to actually watch those. It's quite magnificent work. A beautiful thesis on Michel Serres, obviously, which is very interesting to us. Of course, Michel Serres is one of the few philosophers that consistently made use of the notion of a figure. So I think that might be part of the discussion as well. Then we link this to Richterfein, who is in Utrecht, I think, at the moment, who is in media and culture studies and the University of Utrecht. Of course, well known from his book with Iris van der Tuin on new materialism, foodscapes, and also a book on Michel Serres. So we got a lot of experts on the notion of the figure. And then we have Robert close by, Ivan Allen College, and the School of Public Policy here at Georgia Tech. also the science and technology program. A lot of our PhDs are actually following his program, and an expert with Peter Paul Verbeek on post-phenomenology. And of course, that's the phenomenology so strongly influenced by technology. So a lot of expertise there, and he already prepared a little talk on atlases. So that's our 3 crits. What we're going to do is we start with Christo, who is in San Diego. So San Diego is 3 hours to my west, and then our last actor is actually Juzar, who is, I think, 10 hours to our east, to my right. So we have a huge difference in time zones. We're going to try to keep it within 2-hour range. Last time we did over 3 hours. So we're going to try to keep it within 2 hours. The students will talk about 10, 15 minutes, and then we respond. So feel free to respond whenever you want. Christo, you start.
Thank you, Lars. Do you guys hear me? Hear me well?
Yeah.
All right. So Lucy, that is the Lucy from Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The figure does not take a human form, but it is made of halos that is pure radiance. It transports us to surreal dreamscapes of fulgor, liquidity, and crystallization. Now, Lucy is a structure with a middle zone, with the appearance of halos, and a crystalline and a liquid side that is a hard and a soft side. The middle zone functions as a single axis. It is Lucy's spine. And from there, it sprouts several arms at both sides that you will see that get thickened as we move along each series of images that make these limbs. So let's start with a quote from Adolf Huxley, Heaven and Hell. The soul is transported to its far-off destination by the aid of a chemical, either mescaline or lysergic acid, taking its passengers further into the terra incognita. So you are seeing here the biggest halo in our figure, which is the Visions of Purgatory and Paradise by Dante Alighieri, the drawing of Gustave Doré. This first drawing is the saintly throne in the shape of a rose. And here we see Dante and Beatrice gaze upon the highest heaven. And below is the halo of Beatrice visiting Virgil in limbo, and the halo of the celestial messenger dispersing the evils below that one. So we can say that surrounding the figure with the same amount of white creates the impression that they are floating, suspended in a celestial space of light, indicated by the presence of God. And we are starting with halos, with the transcendence of the body, the radiance and glowing. Gustave, yes, you can scroll down a little bit, Harry. Gustave Moreau's paintings describe this well. First, we see Jacob and the angel. We have the figure of the angel which jumps into the front thanks to the halo coming out of the back of his head. He shines doubleness. And the apparition where the dreadful floating head glows eerily, bleeding, showing clots of blood at the end of his hair. The next two halo paintings are by Fra Angelico, known as the master of the golden halo. First, a detail of the Christ child from the Madonna della Ombre fresco in Florence, Italy, around the 15th century. The viewer of this painting gets dazzled by the radiant disc surrounding the head of the Holy Child, and the detail of the Archangel Gabriel in the painting of the Annunciation. The light shining from the head of the angel jumps into the whole painting, announcing the biggest light that will appear in 9 months to come, illuminating the history of humanity. Quoting Aldous Huxley, Heaven and Hell, religious art has always made use of this vision inducing materials, the shrine of gold. Going along, we see crowns were used to indicate beings who were believed to be ordained by the gods. You can see the portrait of King II, Henry II of England, with his gold crown, and the portrait of Queen Victoria in her crown. The crown for a king and queen shows power, legitimacy, immortality, victory, triumph, resurrection, honor and glory of life after death, right? So I'm talking about the notion of transcendence. We also have tiaras. We can see if you scroll a little bit down, the mummy portrait of a woman painted in encaustic wax, and Julius Caesar's statue with his famous laurel wreaths, right? Paul Virilio writes in The Aesthetics of Disappearance, a false glitter, the aura, light of the great void or nimbus encircling emperors, Christ, and saints, helmets with gems, tiaras, the insignia of power are efficacious prostheses of a royal nirvana that transforms the assistance of the state into manipulation of subjects. So going along, we found, or we get the horns of Moses. The Holy Writer described Moses' face as shining when he descends from the mountain. However, when translated into Latin, a word was changed. The skin of Moses' face was shining, radiant, or shining forth, comes from the Hebrew word Quran, and his Latin translation, Jerome, used the word cornuta, which means horn. The Latin was translated as horns were coming forth from Moses' head. Also, we have an example of a Native American shaman wearing a headpiece with deer antlers, part of a mimetic dance to win over the deer spirits. And at the bottom, we have this same notion of greatness of America, the radiant crown known best on the Statue of Liberty. So if you scroll a little bit down and maybe zoom out a little bit here, I just want to, they can see the rest of the halos. So Lucy displays a whole range of different types of halos. Single, multiple halos, or in a group, flat disc, hexagonal, square, rings. We even have like whirlpools. Halos are about transfiguration. It's a form of appearing, and that is why some halos even become animals or flowers. Until we get a whole body of radiance. The last two are the mandorla, an almond-shaped aureola of light surrounding the entire figure of a holy person. The aura, the halo, the crowns, they all shine a radial pattern, and we can link this to ornament, the whiteness and the glowing gold. All these auras look back to you. It's about transcendence, which means a thing that goes beyond itself. So we have a first contour of the thing in space as a form, and a second contour which is blur, spike, wavy, which means that we have two directions in depicting the halos. You can zoom out to the whole, yeah, thank you, Eric. Outward, away from the form, liquid or liquefy, and inward, towards the form, crystalline, seeking substance. we will see the images will come from the inside out into a soft or hard dream world where we get color, hard and soft. So if we go back to the top, on the left side, we have a liquid state, soft in psychotropics, a connection of liquidity and light, the notion of floating. We start to see visions of colors, wavy lines. She's a Rainbow by the Rolling Stones is regarded nowadays as a psychedelic classic. The track is a Technicolor dream. Some of its lyrics say, she comes in colors everywhere. She's like a rainbow. Have you seen her all in gold? So psychedelic, which means to awaken the mind by hallucinations and distortions. We encounter the psychedelic shows, images. So where these images or these light shows were conceptualized in San Francisco to create the trippy atmosphere for the audience of the art events and rock concerts. The light visuals in the 60s were created with overhead projectors, slides, layers of colored mineral oil and alcohol move over the projector lens and produce changing color patterns. And when illuminated by a light show, the performer were magically transformed into glorious temples of psychedelic scenes. We have an image here of Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd, right, where he's you can see he looks like floating or wavy by the projection of this light show. So we have the connection of things radiant, glowing, being bright, under the influence and seeing visions and patterns. On the right, if you want to pan to the right, we have the crystalline hard side defined by its geometric lines. I'm going to quote here the song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" by the Beatles, which I guess everybody knows, right? But it says something like, "A girl with kaleidoscope eyes, cellophane flowers of yellow and green. Look for the girl with the sun in her eyes." So from the Beatles to Velvet Underground to Pink Floyd and Jimi Hendrix, psychedelic rock arrived in the middle of the 60s with kaleidoscope visions, right? Which are also symptoms of migraine. The word kaleidoscope literally means observer of beautiful things. And it's an instrument for seeing beautiful shapes. From the Greek words kalos, beautiful, and eidos, shape. A kaleidoscope is an optical instrument with two or more reflecting surfaces or mirrors tilted to each other at an angle, so that one or more objects on one end of the mirrors are shown as a regular symmetrical pattern, and when viewed from the other end, due to the repeated reflection, and these reflectors are usually enclosed in a tube containing on one end a cell with loose colored pieces of glass or opaque. The rotation of the cell causes motion of the materials, resulting in an ever-changing view. So in here, we encounter not only multicolors, but also colors in action, colors moving in rotation. This changing of colors, kaleidoscopic projections, send us to another world of visions and patterns, like the Huichol art, with its vibrancy of color. Vibrancy is often created by multiplying contours, and you can see if you zoom a little bit in the Huichol art, we have contours contrasting of gradual coloring types. And I'm going to quote a small part of Carlos Castañeda book, where he recounts his encounters with Don Juan Matus, a Yaqui Indian from northern Mexico. Don Juan and I walked towards the peyote field. This was the first time I tried one. The plant had very bright light. It illuminated the whole field with an intense yellowish or amber light. I thought I would go blind. Everything was alive. Everything had exquisite and intricate detail. I was floating. It was as if I'd fallen asleep and was dreaming. There was so much light that it blinded me. I felt that I was floating, suspended in an enormous undulating ripple. So we have a colorful wrap with shoal art Volkswagen Beetle there, and a Huichol skull, where we see how the vibrancy of color wraps around the contour, creating multiple contours at the same time.
Hey, Christo, you have to round up.
Yes. So we can go to the to the left side, and we can yes. So we see the Volkswagen bus, which is all mutated and by the psychedelia, right? So jumping back.
Can we just like zoom out and you'd like point at a few of the arms?
Sure. So yeah, zoom out. We have the mandalas, which are, we can see how the outside and inner core have layers. Now we will start to see that all arms get thicker when getting closer to the end of the series of the images. They look like overlapping up and down, but they simply do not touch each other. They are separated by their halos. Let's go to some of the fireworks. These images are enveloped in a glowing haze, acting in their own halo, the appearance of things in a double image. So we have also the rose windows filled with light colors, crystallized patterns in rotation by the shimmering rays of light. Geometric patterns also followed down by like the jury tile, right? Where we can see the lines start to get geometric by the radial repetition, and these moves are similar to the textiles and the wallpapers of Christopher Dresser and William Morris. We find ourselves here in a world of transfiguration, where a flower grows from incandescence and becomes a set of images.
Okay, can we zoom out now and see the whole figure? Because we can discuss more and more of the arms, but it's really a question of like the structure as well.
So we have the psychedelic visuals, right? That inspired by Art Nouveau. So the psychedelic effect, we see the vibration is achieved by taking colors from the opposite end of the color wheel, each one having equal value, dark to light, and intensity and brightness. And this goes along with the automatic drawings from André Breton, which are free, with no control, without thought or will intervention from the conscious mind, right? We have some examples there from André Masson, Salvador Dalí, Oscar Dominguez de Calcamonía techniques, and we also have some drawings of Henry Michal's mescaline, which are composed of wavy lines appearing as liquefying visions without pattern, similar to doodling that we have on the right side, that consists of repeated patterns, but not two doodles are the same, although we often return to the same patterns. And we can move down to or zoom a little bit.
No, we need to stop, Christo. You're at 20 minutes now, so.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, okay. Okay, let's see. We can discuss some of this. Who wants to start?
Maybe I can start with. I would have one question that keeps coming back in my head. I assume it's so you were talking and presenting a lot of very strong references. I guess not references. You wouldn't think of them as such, but what I kept thinking all the time is what makes the notion of the figure then different from that of a motif. No? So I'm sure you can say. So I'm sure you have discussed this. This would help me to ask more productive questions, I think.
Is that a question for Christo or for me?
Both.
Well, in this case, they're pretty close. Now, motifs are figures from an aesthetic point of view, and so the question here is: there's a row of halos in the middle. Aesthetic representations of a halo. We have no idea what a halo is, by the way. So it is an aesthetic construct, and it does refer to transcendence. Then it's applied left and right to specific objects, either Volkswagen or the sky when it's about fireworks, or gems when it's about your bracelet. So we get. It does relate to aesthetics in this case. So figures can occupy a certain field, and in this case, the halo as a sort of a broader understanding of an aesthetic understanding of what a halo is, can be applied in different ways through a whole set of aesthetic operations, radial figures, the multiplying of contours, very specific color combinations that you would hardly see in Western art. You know, it's like when you multiply contours with vibrant colors. What is vibrancy? Automatic drawing. So these are all like applied in specific periods and specific times. So it's, yes, it is aesthetic in this case, but in an enormous range of applications. The question is, of course, why does it look like a centipede, or why does it look like the skeleton of a fish? Because it does seem to have a head, it does seem to have a spine, and it does seem to have limbs that go sideways.
Limbs, right? I mean, the word arms was used several times to describe these sort of protrusions or just lines coming from this center form. And that was something I found myself thinking about, right? Are we I can't figure out yet, and I mean, I think this is one of the things we're trying to do today, stepping back from this stuff. Can't figure out yet which metaphors we're sort of centering on here and what they're doing, because it seems like we have these sort of figure metaphors at work that can sometimes even take a human form with things like arms. Then there's also these mapping metaphors at the same time to describe the same things, right? We could think of these as these lines coming off the center as roots, or roots as in like roadways, like a map, rather than arms. They did seem like arms, though, in a way. I don't know. That is also something I was wondering, Lars. You were talking about why does it look like this? Is a good thing to be thinking about at this point.
What I'm thinking about, because there's so many halo types. We got spiky ones, we got blurred ones, we get the rings of Tintoretto, we got crowns that are spiked. we got the shaman antlers, we got Moses horns. There's a whole range of types, which I think is very interesting, but very difficult to put in order. And then the arms seem to go out left and right out of those, and I think that's quite questionable, because it would be very difficult to pinpoint the place where psychedelic posters, if we can zoom in, Heiri, on the psychedelic, because these are very specific and wide. Yeah, well, at the top I do understand, because you're splitting between liquid and crystalline, so that's almost like the halo itself, and it's unapplied, and that's the clearest opposition you get at the top. You get like liquid slides, and you get crystalline kaleidoscopic structures. What I'm more interested in, if we go down, you get like specific sections. Are they related to the middle? Can you zoom? Yeah, stop. Oh, cool. Yeah, and a bit to the left, so we can see the center. Yeah, stop. So why Christo are the psychedelics coming out of the horns of Moses?
Well, actually, the routes, as Robert said, or the horizontal, right, arms, limbs, can, I think they can, there is no relation with the horns in this point. I mean, it's just like a list, right? But the importance, I think, on the left side and right side, it's more evident or important up and down, where the route starts to get thickened, right? Mm. And we almost see them touching up and down with each other, but with the spine or the main axis, the single axis in this case, I think we can this route can be displaced anywhere on this axis. If I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, of course, there is some relation, but I don't think that's the main key to Lucy's whole figure.
Can we zoom out a bit? Yeah. Hi, Rick. Yeah.
I mean, should we comment on this, or what is the idea, Lars?
Well, you can comment or not comment. Yeah.
No. Well, what I found really interesting is, of course, the religious part, and it brought me back to when Deleuze talks of Bacon, and where he talks a lot about the figure. So not Michel Serres, but Gilles Deleuze. He talks also of God, and God not so much as a limiting power, but the fact that when God appears, especially in medieval painting, that God is actually what makes everything possible. And in that sense, that reminded me very much of the idea of the halo. So whereas when Deleuze talks about painting, there's always this kind of the play between line and color. Whereas in the halo, that actually seems to blur, or the opposition, at least, is somewhat gone. And I do like to see how you can write a contemporary history of the halo and see how that blurring, in that sense, kind of evolves or kind of changes. So for me, the religious is quite interesting here in terms of the process of refiguration. I don't know if that is of importance to Lucy.
Well,
but
of course, Lucy is a vision of a trip. So it's an internal image, and the halo, all the images of the halo suggest that you can see a halo. Of course, you cannot see a halo. So we see, if we see somebody winning a game or a race, we say the winner shines, you know, for instance, or somebody's beautiful, we can say somebody radiates. But of course, we don't see that. And of course, what you see in the middle is how you actually make that not being able to see visible. And the blur is one of them, because how would you see a blur? A blur is almost a contradiction, right? Because you're seeing something that you can't really properly see. So that there's a loop here of external vision and internal vision. And and that's, of course, that's the issue, is like, okay, there's the descriptions we have of, for instance, Ernst Junger or Henri Michaud and Oliver Sacks, even, you know, of masculine experiences, also Hashish with Walter Benjamin, as very specific ornamental structures. They use that word very often. And the comparison, you know, with rose windows, we know that from Weir Mitchell, the neurologist. So they give these very specific descriptions between that internal vision and ornament. So, and of course, ornament is the most visible thing because we dress things in ornament. So what do we have here is an aesthetic, a sort of a creating of a sort of plane of images, either if it's in psychedelics in the 1960s or in Art Nouveau in the 1890s, or in Giri tiles in the 1600s in Arab countries or whatever. So all these are very specific applications, which is, I think, guess the right word, of something that is internally seen. Something that's internally seen. So we get this transcendence of things that can only be seen internally. So we get like an impossible loop. Sure, that works with motifs and it works with very specific ideas, but it does say something. You see like objects becoming watery, you see objects multiplying their contours, you see objects extending their contours, making them spiky or blurred or ringed or whatever. So there's a whole range of effects that give a very precise set of tools to what we normally call transcendence. Right? So there's a very specific quality to that sort of objective contour and that sort of extended, expanded contour of the transcendent. And I think in that sense, this is really interesting. And it's no accident that Lucy is long. She has a tail, or she has a huge, massive spine. And I don't know, Christo, how long you could go on with this. And it also depends if you can properly find left and right applications. But I guess in many, many cultures, there's so many experiences that would actually try to either go liquid or crystalline. So I think in that sense, that it's a very precise object. Or figure. I'm just thinking like, what does it mean when they're separated in the middle and they link again up on the left and right side, on the edges? It seems to like the figure makes its own contour by thickening sets of images. So we get like horizontal images and vertical images as variations. That somehow suggests the mobility of images that allows this figure to like operate very precisely, you know. It's like there's a whole set of. It would be really interesting to work on it so long that you actually get an outer contour, right? Of colorations and all kinds of effects that are shared between all these different periods. I think that'd be quite beautiful. Obviously, this is a very strange way of approaching the matter, you know. Of course, most of us are architects, So we work with these tools, we work with images. That's already a question in itself. How do you collect them? How do you then organize them? How do you expand them? And then how do you actually sort of create some kind of machine or mechanism out of it?
But with regard to this, so the ways that you were presenting, Christo, I noted some of the formulations that to me are very inspiring. So, for example, you were speaking of efficacious prosthesis of a nirvana. Then you were, of course, talking about psychotropics. Then radiance, glowing, being bright under the influence of patterns. Then colors in action. Then acting in their own halo. Appearance of double images. Then growing from incandescence. Then animals, flowers, until we get a whole body of radiance. So these are all kind of processes that on the one hand are circuitous or circular, and on the other hand actually are expanding, or at least suggest that. So this to me was very interesting in how you described it. But that's why I was asking about the motif. In the structural representation on the Miro board, it is so so axial, and I didn't get the idea that these circuitous form, for me they were a kind of a formulas. So you could for example place images or sequences and have them mechanized in their interplay, and then look for contours. But I didn't see them as spiraling around one spine. This for me is a bit difficult to make the association right now. A bit as if maybe there are a lot of components of a machine, of a kind of a self-engendering machine or so. But
Well,
I'm not sure.
This is a typical architect's problem. Do you design a building as an animal or as a dead animal? So what you have here is the layout of something, but not its mobility. Right, so and that the axiality. I would draw a diagram of your body or Robert's. It would also have a spine and ribs, but it doesn't sort of. You can only understand it through its mobility. You can only understand the articulation of the parts through its mobility, and I guess that's what he's trying, like with the images on the outer rim, is that they're starting to blur. And I think that sort of suggests a certain mobility. But the question is, of course, if you would have the machine running, so to speak, it would actually start to blur, and you wouldn't see anything. Right? So you actually have to articulate it and be precise before it becomes vague and blurred. I think that would probably be an answer.
Yeah, and I mean the limbs. I mean they can as well as the halo can expand, right? So when they start to thicken at the end, I mean that the intention was to have this action, right? And also this thickening happens when the series of images, let's say on the fireworks, at the end these fireworks kind of they start to be different types of fireworks, right? So we first have the ones single firework in the sky, and then we have group of fireworks, and then we have the whole glowing of fireworks at the same time behind a building, and then we have the towers of fireworks using Latin America as several radial fireworks. So this is when this mobility start to happen, and different from the spine, which is the halo blurs and is single. But Lucy can continue, and I think it can get more mobile, let's say.
So if Lucy travels, where does she travel? Does she travel through time, over the globe, or can we meet her?
Yeah, I mean, if it travels, he will go. For example, I don't know if this is your question. He can go to Aglaia in the map, for example, which is another. I mean,
No, I mean in your life.
in my life. Yeah, I'm surrounded with halos here, I guess.
Okay, that's a pretty religious answer. Okay, let's go to the
one
yeah,
more
okay,
thing.
Rick. Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm the new guy here, so I can also ask silly questions. But why did you decide to turn this into a kind of a two-dimensional kind of a flat surface, as in the representation that I'm seeing now? That's just a question to Krista.
I mean, well, I guess it has to do with the Miro board itself. You know that the way this is mechanized or assembled. In fact, I mean, it's flat, but I mean, like I said, the idea is continue, Lucy. I mean, in all this, it's directional though. The spine is the spine axis is the one that may jump to us right now.
Also, we don't know if it's flat, right? So if you see a world map, you know that there's several distortions and tearings in the map that allow it to be folded back onto a sphere. So basically, we don't know exactly what we're looking at, right? We just like see local connections that are stronger than other connections that are weaker. And sometimes we see tearings between them. So I think there's a whole set of questions how this actually forms a map or a surface. Okay, let's go to the second one.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I'll be discussing the figures of the chest and Hephaestus. Both of these figures are branching figures, and they exhibit contrasting qualities and parallel to one another. And these branches must coexist to create a full figure. So here we start with the chest, and you can see up at the top we have the archaic torso of Apollo, based on Rilke's poem next to it. We have this shining and radiating figure or statue that is suffused with brilliance and shines like a lamp. And the final word or the final line of the poem is, "You must change your life." And so this establishes the chest as a thematic embodiment. Of course, themos being the need to be recognized as oneself and the desire to be recognized. And this branches off into two different aspects of the original chest. There is the live chest, which is alive but unaware, and then there is the dead chest, which is aware but unalive, if you will. Each of these sides subsequently branches out into two sides of its own, creating nested parallel axis pairs. This is similar to the concept of yin and yang, where the pieces of the chest are complementary and they work together to make up the full figure, but the structure continues to branch further and further, sort of in a fractal manner. So we'll move closer into the live chest. Hi, thank you. So the live chest is about independence of the mind and body from its surroundings. It branches into the parallel blood and breath arms. We have a picture of Admiral Lord Nelson standing in as a representation of all generals, really, because the live chest, or the general, is a very live-chested position. So on the top, along the top, we have blood, which is representative of courage, recognition, honor, and manliness throughout many different societies. And so we see the Red Badge of Courage, which is a book, a Civil War novel. And the Red Badge of Courage itself is referencing a wound or some blood gained from battle to prove that you have courage. And so, again, blood is a product of the need to prove oneself. Blood is about the expansion of oneself in battle. It represents the courage and bravery or that come from the chest. Representations of courage and bravery are usually in the image of a heart, which of course is the blood pumping organ in the chest. And they're often trimmed with symbols of nobility or power. Here we have the Purple Heart medallion from the U.S. military, which purple is a symbol or a color of nobility. And then also the Sacré-Cœur of the Vendéan revolt in the French Revolution, which was a patch worn on the chest with a cross above it. And of course, the cross is the ultimate symbol of power, especially for the royalists and Catholics who were revolting at the time. We move lower into the breath part of the live chest, and breath is about air and lightness and contraction and selfness. We see a lot of round buildings here. They're domes. This goes into the to be is to be round. I can't speak German, so I won't attempt to say it in German because I will butcher it, I'm sure. But so the breath is the product of the need to be oneself. It is about contraction from its surroundings, and we see these with the biosphere, for example. There is the dome is constructed to isolate the internal from the external, and the internal being the live chest and the external being everything else. And as before, this contrasts with blood, and it's a complementary aspect of the live chest, blood and breath, and they must exist simultaneously to properly represent the live chest. Of course, the live chest operates independently, and we've seen that contraction into the individual is a major component of live-chestedness, and the live chest is an isolationist figure, which, especially in terms of the atlas that we've created here, isolationism would create a failed figure if it were to stand on its own, but there is a contrasting element to the live chest and the dead chest, and we can move into the dead chest because the dead chest exists alongside the rest of the world and interacts with it. The dead chest is represented, you see on the right, a little out of the frame here, we have an image of Poe's The Man Who Was Used Up, who is this fictitious Civil War general, A.B.C. Smith. He interacts with the world and is found out later to be primarily just a torso with a lot of different prosthetics, of which his manservant is responsible for making sure the prosthetics work properly. And so we have a master-slave relationship and prosthesis. These are the major elements of the dead chest. The master-slave relationship, seen on top, depicts the dependency of the master on the slave for the master's survival, and this gives need for the master to make the slave dependent on him for survival, because a master can't be a master without a slave, and the slave becomes an extension of the master, entering the two into a mimetic relationship. So essentially, the slave's work frees the master from the work that the master would be doing otherwise, and within the master, this triggers a demotic crisis of identity, where the master must change his life in a live-chested response. And so this is a loop system. Lars spoke of the chiastic loop earlier. So the existence of the dead chest requires the existence of the live chest. In other ways, the master's dependency, both, or be it physically, financially, or mentally, on the slaves makes their dynamic similar but distinct from that of a disabled person's dependence on prosthetics. And along the bottom, we have prosthetics. They're the counterpart to the dependency of the master on the slave. Prosthetics allow their user to work for themselves instead of requiring another person to do this. This is still part of the dead chest, however, because it is the user is still dependent on the prosthetic, which is outside of the chest. And in a way, the prosthetics it breaks the chest figure because it is no longer a pure chest, turning an independent figure of strength into a dependent figure of weakness. And from here, we'll move to another figure, which is Hephaestus. Okay, and just a little background as we get to Hephaestus. Hephaestus is the forger god of Greek mythology. It's worth noting that he is the only god with any discernible disability. He is a lame god with clubbed feet, and he gets around with the assistance of automata, which he crafts himself. In terms of the full board, Hephaestus is one of the more nuanced figures that develops out of the forger figure from the beginning of the seminar. And he and his creation branch into parallel axes as well. Hephaestus is a forger of datala, cunningly crafted or designed objects. His works branch into automata and ornament. We can move in closer to automata. And the automata are mysterious, self-moving beings which are capable of being independently intelligent. This intelligence cannot be removed from the object because the object itself is a work of intelligence. And as stated before, Hephaestus uses the automaton to move around. And he also creates others to assist for other gods, which makes the automata a sort of prosthetic in and of themselves. But this only becomes a proper prosthetic once they become mimetic, which is where the other axis, ornament, comes in. Ornament is the embellishment and overworking aspect of the entire object it is being created. The ornament cannot be separated from the object because the object itself is a work of ornamentation. And the automata become prosthetic through mimesis, which develops through ornamentation. In terms of Hephaestus, intelligence and ornamentation are both bound together. Hephaestian mimetic objects are inherently both intelligent and ornamental, and the two aspects are complementary, and the presence of one necessitates the presence of the other. So, in conclusion, both the chest and Hephaestus figures, we can see the starting from a single idea, the splitting into two aspects, and then splitting again. I expect this process could be repeated for quite some time. We may find a limit if we kept going with this branching fractal-like exploration, but we may not. This clearly wouldn't work for every figure that is being presented today, but the ability to do this could represent a distinct category of figures.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Hayden. Let's see.
Thank you.
Plot is thickening.
No, it's interesting, right? So we had so much discussion at the end of the previous presentation about sort of bodily appendage and sort of bone structure kind of metaphors. And then here in this talk, which again I thought was really good and interesting, I especially like the stuff on prostheses and ornaments. The language used here, and you can see why in the different structure this part of the map takes, was so much one of branches, right? And it seems like, and that's actually super interesting to have instead a kind of uh, uh, to draw on plant metaphors rather than animal body metaphors, right? And it seems right, and I'm wondering if that's something we need to grab hold of for the rest of the day as well, to see how much that fits on, because it really could, right? We're wondering if this is a globe or a map, or is this a body with arms or a rib cage or something like that. And then here it's more like, no, maybe this is something with a trunk and branches, and then branches off of those branches. Maybe we'll find roots. Like where do those metaphors lead us? What sort of reference do those metaphors lead us to look for? That's part of what this got me thinking.
It's interesting to me. I was thinking of a kind of a motor, actually, an engine which out of a difference produces. When in the end also you were speaking of categories of figures. So that the interplay between between this chest figure and the Hephaestus figure, the forger of the Daedala. But then where I got stuck is what would be a chiastic loop motor, or a motor that would not only work a difference and make products, but actually move around the chiastic loop.
Well, that's a good question.
Because it couldn't be a rationalization chain, no? It would have to be more complete. It would have to be more spatial, not linear. I like the idea a lot, but I can't imagine it right now.
A chiastic loop motor? Why not? Well, I guess because it runs on asymmetry. So if we construct bodies that are symmetrical and then we apply asymmetry to them, that means they start to fall or move. So and that means they reach out by movement, right? So this idea of being structured also means like it's a way of connecting too. I guess would be an answer. So in that sense, the vegetal and the animal is sort of overlapping, because it's the branching out of the one becomes the moving of the other. But I do think it means that always its attributes are asymmetrically deployed to meet others, right? So there's a certain interest. There's a certain interest. Can we look at that other one again? That loop, that crazy loop with the chest? Because I don't want to sort of bring up manliness, but Jesus. It is a massive issue in especially in right-wing theories. You know, the men with chests and the themos from Fukuyama, and now of course the idea of Bachelard and breathing and Sloterdijk, because sort of this whole idea of contraction, right? So we get this limbless body, which is of course the start of Sloterdijk's book, and then it sort of takes a turn. It takes a turn and then says, well, you know, you actually need prosthesis if you're only a torso, and it means instead of a figure of strength, it becomes a figure of weakness. And what is also interesting is that the master-slave dialectic becomes a fully technological body prosthesis dialectic or extension, whatever, if it's a dialectic or not. Which is quite another reading of history here, because it means that there's a technological plot to the master-servant relationship in that sense. So that instead of writing a human history of master-slaves, it becomes a prosthetic history of being extended. That loop is quite shocking, and those two images of the archaic torso and with Rilke, and then that sorry figure on the floor, that lump of flesh, which is almost the reverse of Rilke's. Of course, it's the general who just won, I think, a battle in the Civil War. I don't remember the story of Edgar Allan Poe. The man was used up. I know Rilke refers to it a few times. But it is a strong figure. It is a shining general, with a number of won battles on his name. So it's a laureled figure. And then he's unpacked. And instead of standing, it lies like flat on the floor. The contrast with the pedestal above it is quite stunning. I just, as a loop, I think it's very interesting.
I do hate to do this, but I have a class starting in a few minutes, so I have to leave now. But thank you for the commentary. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hayden.
I do have another comment here on the master-slave thing, because, I mean, I think the whole kind of metamorphosis is quite interesting. The chest and the living and the non-living. But why do we need a master and a slave metaphor? I mean, we mentioned Michel Serres already, and when he talks about the parasite, that's actually a much more interesting way of thinking about relationships, because it's not really about some kind of an opposition and to forms of life, but parasite is very much about a host, and the host that continues to give and does not understand that slowly, but in the end, inevitably, it will turn into something else, being kind of, it will be taken over by a parasite, and thereby changing its being.
Well, Rick, I think that's the argument of this whole loop. So it follows first the argument of the chest and the contraction of the chest and men with chest, and then it sort of says, well, you're fully dependent on your servants.
Right, but then I would move away from master-slave and more focus on like the host and the parasite. That would be more big, especially because there's no rationality involved, right? The host keeps on giving and loves to give to the parasite, and the parasite kind of like sucks it all up and changes things. And then all of a sudden something new comes into existence. No, but I see this happening here too.
Well, that new thing that does happen on the right side, which we'll get to later. I do think a lot of these figures are based on research. I think that needs to be said. So you see readings, you see quotes from readings, and that's already a selection. And then they often follow a sort of historical trail. So within the structure of the figure, you often see like little histories. And so to actually, to understand the classic the classic conceptualization of technology is that of the master and slave, right? So, and of course we know that from architecture really well. The master of the house, its servants, all that development to home technology, refrigerators, air conditionings. So there's this transformation of human slaves to a sort of technology extension, and that you then say, well, this is actually a parasitical relationship. We actually call it a mimetic relationship. So instead of like seeing it as prosthetic, as an extension of the pure self, where the master is still the master, there's a mimesis. So that means that, the slave actually becomes the master and the master becomes the slave. So there's a reversibility in that structure, and that's mimetic. So we don't call it host and parasite, we actually call it prosthetic and mimetic. So there's a reversal. But of course the question is, if there is a reversal, how does that figure then stabilize and transfigures, right? And is then not a pure chest. So I think in that sense your comment is correct to actually say, look, it's hosting.
Mm-hmm.
It's a form of hosting and parasite. It's just it follows a very precise construct. So the hosting, the giving is really done by hand. It's an extension of the body. It is a gift. That is in the sense that it's prosthetic. It's a reaching out. And the other is a mimetic relationship of the servant adapting to the master and taking over a life. So it's not symmetrical. So the relationship between the host and the parasite is not the same as between the parasite and the host. And I think that's the real chiastic structure here. You know that the example of the chiasmus is always foul is fair and fair is foul of Macbeth. But the way fair is foul is not the same as the way the reverse fair is foul, right? So they're not symmetrical. They're not symmetrical. Though they sound symmetrical, they're actually not. So I think the question then is really, is the parasite then returning the gift? And how is that done? Not by the same extension. That must be a proper transmutation, which is then the appearance of the whole.
What would you say, Vera?
Well, I think in the figure here, it's the cybernetic self-recursion with the environments that make new environments, and everyone opens up a space, but it also takes away a space. But I can't imagine then is how, it's always how to get out of this compartmentalization dynamics. But what I thought is interesting is the speaking of categories then of figures. So to actually have this, so that's why I was calling it a motor, so a mechanics that is not producing a product but driving processes. So that would be the categorial with respect to a process of figuration that kind of is moved by or motivated by a host parasite relation, perhaps, or at least this kind of asymmetrical, so symmetrical plays that are being not orchestrated but influenced, no, by something separate from them. So the discrete, but I'm not sure. I mean, in my thinking, it's always important to have the discreteness of things. So I'm much less with continuity and topologies and so on. I like the categories to think about the topics. But I'm also a bit wondering. I mean, I don't have a clear the chest. A clear space of association, I must say, to the chest, to the amputated chest of the classical figures.
I think it also refers to Plato's tripartite, the logos, themos, eros. This whole idea of themos, as the essence of a man, right? Which is really funny, because Selbstständigkeit, the independence of a man, right? We're talking manliness here. Standfastness is then expressed by pure torso. So being without legs. And I think that's just a very interesting paradox. You get a lot of writing on this idea of standfastness and independence, and things contracting on themselves, and then not having limbs makes that a paradox.
Just a footnote.
But
But
is
of
it
course,
is a genuine figure?
yeah. Just a footnote. You link this to masculinity, of course. I guess the Venus de Milo in Paris, in the Louvre, has also served for so many centuries as a kind of an ideal of femininity, which is also, of course, a torso and well, maybe a bit more, but not too much.
Well, she stands. She stands, and we actually have her in here. There we go. And we're not discussing this one today, but on the left side, she develops her drapery. On the right side, her standing. Right, so that's a sort of a figure that both stands as well as being draped. And so on the left side, you see more and more drapery. On the right side, you see her turn into a column.
Yeah. But with the torso, I don't remember how the story goes, but there is with Caesar, he has this armor. So then the armor of the chest it becomes this singularly seamless kind of. It's not a double. It's kind of like a double skin, but not really. It's never meant to be a skin.
The thorax, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have the thorax too. And
it's then almost it's an interesting mixture, like always with weapons, no, between ornament and shielding off. But I must say then, so from how we discussed now, there seems to be quite a narrative, straightforward line in this one. It appears, because if we follow this, this plain symbolism with the chest and the manlyhood, and then in order to be able to stand up, to stand forth, it needs to have artificial support structures and so on. Then it becomes somehow almost a bit sad about that. I thought it's interesting with the blood and the breath lines, because the blood and the breath lines they kind of add this something like natural elements that are larger than the figures, which would complicate the image of the master being used up. I mean, if you think the master as a figure that is kind of inevitably being used up from what it depends upon for being a master, then we are in a closed circuit. Yeah.
No, of course it is a question in itself. If this is actually a motor, what kind of images, if it produces images or figures, what kind of images does it spit out? Right. So I think in that sense, the host-parasite question is a really important one, because it understands this as a mutation. So if you put that image of Poe on top of the image of Rilke, it's like, what kind of hybrid would you get? Right. So that if you actually see this as a machinery, what would it actually produce? Not only move, because when it moves about, it can sort of express different attributes of itself. But as you would see it as a sort of machinery to produce images of these type of mutations, it would maybe produce a whole other set of images. Where we would need completely new tools to actually produce those. Like Photoshop or whatever.
Yeah, but one thing I like about the motor it's a bit different from the machine because it's pretty generic. So a motor drive,
sure.
it's like a driving force. It's not, so it's something separate from the articulation of the process that is then being differentiated, driven by the motor.
Yeah, but I do think somehow it starts to like suggest that you cannot properly show the figure. So you can actually build the machine. You can actually construct the machine as a sort of model of figuration, but you cannot actually show what the figure looks like. So you're showing the motor, and it uses images, but it actually produces other types of images or figures, but we can't really show those. I think there would be another set of operations.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, shall we go to the next one? Irie.
Yes. So I will present 3 figures today, and we will jump from one to another. I will start by presenting my first figure, Gloria. Gloria is a PT house. It's a technology adapting to human attributes, and it's originated within the Ballard story, The Thousand Dreams of Stella Vista. And from Gloria, I will move to Cyborg towards the left side, which I see them as the 2 sides of a single coin, where we have a technology adapting to the human attributes, then we have the humans adapting and absorbing the technology and creating a hybrid entity out of this interaction with the technology. And then from Cyborg, I will jump all the way to this right side, where I will talk about the forger, a figure of techne, a tecton, a weaver, maker, builder, and we will talk about forger in detail later. And as we have talked, I will stay in this horizontal plane, and I will jump from one to another figure, but then I will move vertically from up and down, between up and down within the figures themselves. And these figures are very much connected with the surrounding figures that you are seeing here. And sometimes they are the extension of the single figure, like the forger extending into the dwarf as the dark side of the forger, working on a hard metal in a cave with the fire, and then producing its automata, like Hephaestus's automata, which moves us to the idea of the soft and hard robots, which will turn into the figures of Olympia from Hoffman's story, and then Gloria from Ballard's story. So if I zoom into Gloria, the Gloria is not any ordinary psychotropic house. The idea of psychotropic house in Ballard's story is mainly it's made out of a material called plastex. It's very much like skin and muscle. It changes its form to accommodate its inhabitants, and it echoes the habits of the users. A psychotropic house mainly has a memory, learns the habits of its users, and changes form like expanding like a lung, or opening and closing its skin, or bulging or the ceiling, or thickening the walls like the heart. That way it accommodates its user. However, Gloria is not an ordinary psychotropic house. Gloria, we gave the name Gloria because the first user of this very specific psychotropic house was a movie actress called Gloria Steinman, and she had quite a big character, and later in the story we learned that she actually killed her husband in this psychotropic house. And later this couple, Howard and Faye, when they moved in Gloria, they started to see the echoes of Gloria, echoes of this movie actress within the attributes of the house itself. So Gloria does not directly accommodate the new tenants. However, Gloria becomes a third character in the story and starts creating a love and jealousy with the protagonist Howard. And towards the end of the story, Gloria attacks his wife and rejects the commands of Howard, and somehow Howard manages to save Faye, but this interaction caused a breakup and they divorce. However, Howard stays living in Gloria with one condition, that he turns off Gloria. So Gloria turns into a static house that we have today. So we can see the fragments of Gloria, even though it's a fictional character or fictional house, we see her fragments in our daily lives, like Alexas or smart cameras or the thermostats. And within architecture, Ballard's story had a quite significant influence from pneumatic structures controlled with the air conditioning to literally pillion architecture where the walls are moving or walls are shape-shifting to muscle-like structures with the pneumatic structure that observing, sensing the inhabitants and forming that. So Gloria gains a consciousness, maybe we can call it the epitome of Ballard's idea of technology gaining consciousness. Gloria gains consciousness through mimesis of its inhabitants. So from Gloria, I will move to Cyborg, which we are more familiar figure. Like Gloria, we see the appearances of the cyborg in science fiction genre, especially in comics, in movies, in TV series like Doctor Who, where these cyborgs called Cybermen or Daleks, they think they are superior to the human race because they are the hybrid entities. They are the upgraded version of the human species. And today, actually, we see this idea of cyborg literally as a hybrid of machine and human in our daily lives, where people are using a third thumb or an extension of their arm or an extra limb attached to their bodies to perform daily activities. In one of these examples, the third thumb project, one interesting thing I want to note that in the interview with the user says that after the third week, the thumb became an extension of their body, and they observed the thumb as a limb of the body as well. So they started to using their thumb without a conscious decision, unconsciously somehow. And of course, these literal hybrid machines or hybrid bodies moves beyond defining the cyborg. Within the Donna Haraway's influential text, the Cyborg Manifesto, actually, with her words, we are all cyborgs, we are all entangled with the technology, which I exemplified through the lineage of starting with the insect or arachne weaving her web to Penelope and to a weaver in front of the loom to the Jacquard's loom, where the weaving activity itself is automatized and somehow created the first prototypes of the computer that we have today. And from Arachne's web to the, of course, World Wide Web, to the telecommunication web, to the Facebook web metaverse, where we literally the avatars are becoming the reflected image of the subject itself. So there is a self-othering, self-alienation, and which I want to exemplify with this very short video where the user is using his robotic arm to exercise, but the arm dies and it rejects the commands of the user. So there is this separation of the body, even though there was an absorption of the technology in the first place, it becomes very easily a gap, a separation from the technology as well. And then I will jump to the forger, which I believe is the precursor of both Gloria and Cyborg, where our relation with the tools are defined. Aristotle, of course, if we refer to Aristotle, he says that hands are the tools of the tools. So within his view, the tools are extension of the bodies. On the other hand, we also absorb the tools. So they are like a cyclic movement where the tools are becoming an extension of body, and then tools are becoming internalized and becoming a part of the body as well. So this movement toward, between the body and the tool and the absorption is pretty important, because we see its reflection in the making of the object, making the appearance of the object, and within the appearance of the object, the working is pretty much evident. So that's why I would call the forger as the precursor of the Cyborg and Gloria, which will become later more about the both the self-movement and the self-alienation. I think I use my time wisely. Yeah, that's pretty much it from me, and I'm happy to answer your questions and take your comments.
I can jump in first again if we like. I feel like there's been a theme to my comments in a way I didn't expect. So to see a third presentation here now with another structure emerging in the way that the components are organized with respect to one another, right? If the first one had these kind of body metaphors, and then the second one had kind of plant metaphors, which makes sense because the content was body parts and prostheses or something. Here, Heiri, the way that you've organized these, it's really interesting, right? There's almost like a geometrical shape to some of the graphical organization here. I'm wondering why that might be, but wondering actively, right? It's not baffling. It seems it makes some sense, right? I appreciate in your organization here the way that there is some interesting structure to it. Something I was struck by in the figure of the cyborg was just how ambivalent the examples were that you chose. Cyborg metaphors are sometimes yielded in this utopian way, and you certainly have some sort of positive and forward-looking versions, but you also have as much or more these sort of negative versions, I actually quite like your Doctor Who examples in a way I didn't expect at first. I mean, I was happy to see Doctor Who stuff, but then it was like, oh, it's neat the way you've set this up, where with both the case of the Dalek and the Cybermen, you have these characters who are ostensibly happy and proud to be cyborgs, who are the villains, right? These characters who are cyborgs, excited to be cyborgs or content to be cyborgs. They want to spread the fact that they're cyborgs, and yet, they're presented in the show as monstrous and problematic exactly because they're cyborgs. So those were interesting ones to choose. I mean, you could say similar things about some of the other things that you've brought up. Cyborg, the comic book character or something, is a character who has all these neat powers, but is also often sad and feels like he's cursed or something like that, has been through turmoil. Those are my quick observations. I might like to hear more of your thinking about those choices, because they're striking and interesting ones.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. So, starting with the formalism of these figures, the forms, actually they are somehow referring to neighboring figures. Like when we are talking about Cyborg, of course, the figure of Olympia is a very important part of the idea of the technology and self-movement. And there's this diagonality which is shared by not only by Olympia but also the stilt man, where the prosthesis is becoming a part of the body, and they are becoming, I would call them as cyborgs as well. The stilt man's moving with the technology, moving with these material entities on Earth. So there's of course this formal relationship between the figures, but there are also like these internal relationships with loops and branching, where the self-movement of the cyborg in terms of the mechanical parts moving to Olympia and becoming this automaton, and then it's becoming this love relationship between the human and the automaton Olympia, which bringing us back to the Gloria, where there is another type of love relationship where we are talking about this psychotropic house echoing this movie actress Gloria, and the Howard, the guy, falling in love or like becoming obsessed with the Gloria and living in the memories of Gloria within the psychotropic house. So there's also this cyclic turn, internal turn, where there's this diagonality in terms of the form. Yeah, so when we started actually building the Miro board, these formal relations were very interesting for us, because they somehow emerge within the figure rather than we are like imitating a form to fit into the place. So I'm not quite sure why. Well, is it an attribute of the figure, or it's an attribute of how we work, how we think? But that was an interesting outcome of the whole process of having a collective Miro board.
I mean, it's pretty obvious to bring in a feminist argument, of course, if you quote Donna Haraway, especially since we talked about the male chest before, and then now turning to the cyborg. Yeah, I would like to know more about how you think about other forms of embodiment, kind of in relation to this kind of dominant paradigm of masculinity in this sense.
Sure. Let me zoom in a little bit more to this corner. So there's a way, especially within the, I call it thread, that like horizontal line of mimesis. There's a very strong feminist attribute, like starting from forger and thinking the forger as a weaver, which links us, of course, the myth of Penelope and Arachne and Athena as the goddesses of the craft. Then, of course, there's this dichotomy even today with the within our language that we are using craftsmanship, where we are somehow ignoring all these female figures within the craft as well. Of course, we didn't really focus on this dichotomy or this interaction, but what I want to focus on in terms of the embodiment, Haraway's Cyborg was a very interesting figure. Of course, one, it doesn't have a gender, and two, it doesn't have a form. And as I have exemplified here, we have Gloria as an extension of Cyborg. We have Olympia as an extension of the in between the automaton and the Cyborg. And then we have all these monsters and makers and forgers and ourselves within the embodiment of the Cyborg. So I guess my answer would be there's not a clear opposition or clear dichotomy between the masculinity of the torso and then the feminist attribute of the Cyborg within the Miro board itself, but I guess it's more an internal links that emerge within the discussions.
Yeah, I was not talking about an opposition. I think that what Haraway is also searching for is ways in which you can think the body differently in kind of in contrast to this kind of dominant narrative, which is for her also a way to rethink femininity, of course. But
yeah, but what I find interesting, and it's kind of building up with the different figures, it's as if these figures, they become yeah, of course, kind of inclusive reference points, no? So the dynamics is one. It's indeed one of. It's not so much with difference on a comparable scale, but it's about these figures are. They're not like miniatures. They become maximizing, absorbing, growing bodies, no? And yeah. So there's something. It's almost as if these figures, which are usually something like das Sinnbild, no, für Adequacy and für Moderateness and für Maßstäblichkeit, so scaledness, they kind of breathe colossality almost, and this is quite, of course, quite challenging to discuss then in especially in such a genealogy as you are proposing it. So with having the forger as the what would it be then? So a forger is would it be the creator or the craftsman or the architect, or how are you thinking of the roles in such a kind of artificial procreation cyclicity?
I'm not sure if it would be the appropriate to call the forger as the creator, because that implies that it somehow emerged from nothing. So this ontological question, I'm not quite sure how to answer about the forger, but as I said, the way I see forger as the precursor, maybe in terms of the creator of the automaton, like moving to forger to dwarf to Hephaestus to automaton to Olympia and Gloria and Cyborg, and then like looping back to the forger, I think it's more of in my head, it's more of a mimetic relationship where it's like moving in between conscious and unconscious stage. And forger herself or themselves within this constant loop of knowing and not knowing and reprising their activities and gaining that unconscious state where, like in the examples of playing the violin, learning it step by step to reprising those steps over and over again in a way that now your body is absorbing the violin in a way that you are unconsciously pressing on the strings and moving your bow on the violin. So yeah, I think that's more of a cyclic relationship within the forger itself.
Yeah, but nevertheless, the sense of an expansion, of a kind of an acquisition of colossality, let's say. Is it something I'm just projecting, or does it play kind of a role in the approach to think figuration like that?
You mean the expansion of the figure?
Yeah. So there's a transcending kind of, it's like a transcending, an embodiment that grows from transcendence. No. So there is. I hesitate to describe it as dialectical. I'm aware that's probably not how you would like to think of it, but there is still a kind of a growth of
Yes.
changing
Yeah,
state,
definitely.
say, through the figure. So where and I find this quite interesting to rethink the figure, because it has been this almost moralistic device, no, to always remind everybody of adequate moderateness, and it's almost as if they do the opposite in the approach to figuration here. I mean, in all three of the presentations I've heard so far, actually, but yeah. I mean, you are quite direct with the name, so you have the Cyborg and the Gloria. And then, yeah, so.
Yeah, that's one of the attributes of the figure that we have discussed, the growth of the figure and the expansions. And branching out of those expansion was one attribute, and the other attribute you somehow mentioned that is like these figures are mobile as well, and when you move them and create different links with the other figures, when they neighbor with the other figures, they also change their attributes a little bit more as well. So they are not only growing, but they are also changing their attributes based on their relation with their neighboring figures. That was one of the exercises actually we would like to try, that like what happens if we move forger within relationship with the dwarf and Gloria to bring it to stilt man and the torso, how the figure of the forger changes within that relationship. Or if we move it to all the way to the later we will discuss Octopus and forger, how they interact with each other and change their attributes.
But one thing that I strangely didn't consider until now. So you're working with these 5 different figures, no? The one that is floating, the one that is falling, jumping, and so on. Are then these figures? Would Gloria would she be doing all of those, or would she represent one of those? For example, Gloria, it could be the Cyborg or any other. How is this relation with the five kinds of figures? And then the instance, well, yeah.
I mean, I believe Lars will answer it better, but the initial is these 5, the standing, jumping, floating are stances. So these stances can be found in every single figure. And actually, when we started the Miro board, forger was a part of the standing stance. but later Forger developed its attributes through, as you said, growing, and it started to gain the stance of jumping. It started to gaining the stance of floating as well. So in the process, that was more about the, I guess, evolution of the figure itself in relation to stances. But right now, I do see those different stances within each figure.
Mm-hmm. Because if it's like that, then, I mean, there was the question you asked in the beginning, Lars, now how to think of them. They're territorial, but they're not on the ground. So then it's the association would be that these figures actually are kind of growing infantry in an infantry kind of stadium, subsequent constructs, let's say, of nationalities or something like that. So, I mean, I'm just extrapolating symmetrically. No, I'm not saying anything specific with that, but I keep thinking of the questions that with which you were framing the discussions as well, and I think they're quite interesting. So then, how to, yeah. But then the question of, if it were like this, then the question of the nation has an identity at its core. No? A political one.
Lars, you're muted.
I always mute myself. We see them as territories, but not as grounded. So they're capable of acting. In that sense, they're bodies too. So they're large, colossal bodies, and they can interact with each other on a certain plane. I'd say. So in that sense, that there is a sense of ground because there must be a plane where they meet. But we haven't really tested it. We talked about it a lot. Because what you're seeing is both an atlas as well as a chart, as well as a board. So there is a genealogy, or there's a sense of kinship, and you see those lines like mimesis, and you see them develop from like each other, and that links them. But that doesn't mean that they're placed. Right, so they have origins and they have relations, but that doesn't mean they can't meet others. They're not very different from us, so to speak. But that's not something we properly tested, and that's also the question why I'm raising this issue of are they figures or are they more like machines to produce figures? And I'm not really sure that. I think when I would look at a figure and I would try to map it, I would see something like a machine with all its attributes and the relationships. I wouldn't sort of try to depict a body, but it is quite shocking to us ourselves that they have internal structure as well as external contours, as well as like limb-like, because at the beginning they were all clusters. Let's put it like that. So almost like viral. They're very simple bodies, and you see a lot of those in mood boards, in Gerhard Richter's boards, and memory boards, on refrigerators, and you see a lot of cluster-like types. And in Aby Warburg, it's the same. You see a lot of clusters. You hardly see series or grids or matrices. And the more we developed them, they more started to like cohere, and we started to understand them more as machines, and you get these different types of axialities, and we started to talk about them as mechanics and motors, and that sort of raised the question of like what in our case exactly a figure is, and how would it behave. So we're still like thinking. That's why we invited you guys, If it is an atlas or a chart or a board, I think in the sense of a board, what is important about a board is that it's vertical, and that when you look at it, And in this case, it's a collaborative board. It's already extremely interesting that it's not a black board, it's a white board. So you're allowed to put like images and lines on, and it's highly constructive in that sense. So, and of course, most of the contributing actors are architects or have a background in architecture, so they're very used to these tools. But we're not sure if it is an atlas, actually. And if it is an atlas, would it actually close upon itself? Or would it find edges? Or would it tear internally? What type of fittings and misfittings do we have? Because we talk about motors, how would motors link up? And would they then function in specific sequences? Or can they actually change relations? So I'm just throwing back the questions.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing so a lot of the images that are there are one could say they're so iconic that one could almost think of them as canonic, no?
Yeah.
And if one does, then it's not a big step to think of them as figures, because that's what a canon is.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and that's a major interest. I mean, that's no secret. We talk about mimesis, we talk about figures, we talk about grace, sympathy, all those sort of major. We just look at them in a non-canonical way. So we don't base our analysis on the canon, but we derive the material from the canon, because I think there's a reason why we think it is important, and why they keep on returning. And I think when they keep on returning, they must have something of the figural. You can also see from the mixture of images, there's some of anthropological, a lot of art history, a lot of anthropological material from very, very aesthetic material coming from very different angles. And I think that's also one of our main interests, is sort of these mixtures. What always bothers me is if we can find rigor, especially when you want to be transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. And architects are sort of used to be multidisciplinary in the sense that, they sit at a table and all the disciplines are at the table and they speak back, and they always, that's a sort of, and the architect sort of brings it together. But this is a way of trying to find that canon, but I guess with new tools.
Yeah, but the way we are working in our studio has, I guess, kind of a similar interest, but we always try to not use the canonical, the classical iconic images directly, but to find ways of indexing them, evocating them without presenting them. I guess to find a way. I'm interested in finding a way to the canon which would not go through representation. So mimesis, yes, but mimesis very much with becoming and not with speaking in the name of or trying to share the symbolical power, but to absorb, no? There's a dynamic. There's a way to think of the canon where relating to the canon is a way to set free.
Yes, well, I would agree, but it doesn't mean you cannot address the canon. It's just that you have to find another way to address the canon. I myself, I find this really, really important. Instead of like going to the periphery and to alternative figures, I'd rather go to the central figures, but find an alternative reading and construction of it. I just think, if you look at sort of a history of canonical images or ideas, you see sort of always these entities going from idea, to form to. There's this whole range of entities, and I just keep on thinking there must be a reason why they're entities. So I'm as interested in the discrete as you are. I find the discrete must be chiastic because it must be stabilizing because it relates to itself. It holds on to itself. So there must be something double in it. There must be something double in it. It cannot just be a pure entity, which is contracted, right? There must be this, and then we see a lot of these loops here, and a lot of different asymmetries as well. But yeah, they do address the canon.
Yeah.
So we're not trying to find new images in that sense. We're not trying to find new images. But maybe we do try to find new ways of categorizing or using them.
Maybe.
Yeah, what I'm trying to find is something like vernaculars to address the canon. So on the categorical level, of course, that's an interest, but this is abstract. So, and on a modeling relation. But to refer to speak about it. So rather than because the way then would not be one with authority, but one that emancipates actually.
Yeah.
Not emancipates. It would be liberating. But
Well,
for that, it needs to have a language which is not authoritative. So vernaculars.
Yeah.
Why not go for vernaculars? And vernaculars also with images. But I'm not sure if this works, or what this means. It's just to. Rick, what are your thoughts to this? I'm very curious.
Yeah. I mean, I'm all into rewriting history in that sense and into searching for different ways of patterning. So I do like how in all three the perspectives that we took, that there's also a process of unfiguring going on, like moving away from the aura or the chest, or I don't know where we started with the last one, but
the Lucy, yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of the different forms of transition, and I mean, you don't want to use a Deleuzian term like deterritorializing, but Deleuze also says that for him it would be interesting to search for a way of so you have relative deterritorialization, but also an absolute deterritorialization, which means kind of an ongoing creative moving away and becoming imperceptible in that sense. And that's an interesting kind of trajectory for me. Maybe that's what's...
That's all true, but the reason why we're not writing about this, why we're not doing a bunch of papers, is for a very specific reason. Because in all this imperception and invisibility and this blurring, we find precision. We find rigor. So slowly developing from clusters and from little rectangles, we start to see, okay, if these are actually motors or machines, they must have single poles or double poles or specific asymmetries that makes them work. And that's exactly what we were interested in. So there's a reason why one is a triangle, why one is a rectangle with gaps, why one is a loop, why one has a Latin cross, why one is a Greek cross, why one is double parallels. There's an incredible morphology here, all to produce this not just internal stability, but also this imperceptibility. because radiance you cannot see, right? So this is a multiplicity of images that are overlapping and becoming out of focus. And we can drag images out of them, but basically there's this construct of the figure that behaves, brings in this very specific mood and a very specific type of actions. Though you cannot exactly pinpoint, you cannot exactly meet. We found that actually making use of the canonical images helps us to understand how this works.
Yeah, it almost sounds Simondonian to me, right? There's a kind of a tendency towards particular patterns in processes that in the end will lead to rectangles and triangles and droplets and whatever. Yeah.
Lars, do you mind if I share my screen for a moment?
No, not at all.
That's something I can do. Yeah, I guess. Let me see if I can. PowerPoint. Powering my PowerPoint now. This looks like Blue Jeans, not PowerPoint, though, doesn't it? Stop sharing. Try this again. Nope, that's not doing it.
You have to,
Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay, you can see the PowerPoint now?
Yeah.
Very good. Sorry. So I've been thinking about these things in a similar way, and I just wanted to share these things before I run out of time. I've got just, I think, 5 minutes here. So one way we can step back, I think, and maybe attack some of these same issues is to think about what we're doing with an atlas as a tool, right? And I think if I infer that the way that we've been talking about atlas so far has been as a map, as a collection of maps, but actually another way that the term atlas gets used in science in particular is as a compendia of images, right? Images that train perception, right? That train a scientist's perception, right? So an atlas in, say, botany will be this compendia of images. Here's what this flower looks like. Here's what this flower looks like. And I wanted to, so I kept thinking in preparation for today of this line of work by these two historians / philosophers of science, Lorraine Daston and Peter Galison. They're sort of rock stars in this sort of intersection of history of science and philosophy of science. And they've done some work on the idea of objectivity, which hasn't come up here much, right? Because we've been so situated in the way we've been thinking about this stuff. But imagine if someone else were to take up this atlas, if you were to hand it to someone else, say this is what we did this semester, how would they look at and interpret these things? That's one of the questions I was thinking about before today, and it got me thinking about what Daston and Galison say. They say that in the history of science, if you look at, so what they've done is a sort of history of these atlases, right? Books and books and books, sort of training manuals throughout the history of science, and they say you can actually see these patterns in atlases that I think might be useful for our conversation today, right? They say actually when it comes to the way that scientists have made these atlases over the years, you can see these that when they appeal to objectivity, they do it in at least 3 different ways. Not that we're appealing to objectivity, but there is a question about what we're doing here, right? I mean, this is a question we're actively talking about right now, like what's going on when we assemble this group of images, and so many of them are images from the canon, so many of them are images from art history. What are we doing here? How are these things? Are they representative? Are they exemplars? Are they authoritative somehow, right? What are we trying to say? What Daston and Galison say is that there's been these three different sort of scientific virtues that inform what objectivity is today. One of them they call truth to nature. And it works like this. They say something like, yeah, actually in early atlases, here's a picture of a rhododendron. This is from a botanical atlas from, I have a year, from the 1840s. This isn't a picture of one particular, this is the scientists here didn't draw a picture of one particular rhododendron, but actually studied a whole bunch and assembled in their mind this sort of representative rhododendron, which is kind of cool, right? This isn't a picture of one. It's somehow a picture of many of them, so that they can present the kind of ideal form of rhododendron. That's what they thought they were doing with this picture, right? That's one way that we can think of, and that's one way scientists used to think of what it meant to be objective and what they're doing when they collect a bunch of images together, right? Here's a representative picture that's not actually any particular rhododendron, but actually a whole bunch of them.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's another type of virtue, what Daston and Galison call mechanical objectivity, right? So if here is a truth to nature type of images from an atlas of snowflakes, you can see another set where they're all kind of broken, right? So we can compare these two different, one a sort of truth to nature style compendium of snowflake images, but then we've got a kind of mechanical objectivity virtue where the scientists making this kind of picture, we're saying, look, now we're hands off. We're not trying to give you an ideal image. Actually, what we're trying to do is say, like, look, we didn't touch these things. And see how they're kind of broken and stuff? We're just giving you a kind of example here from the world, and we can make of it what we want, right? With our sort of tools, we'll leave we'll leave the artifacts, right, in the image to try to lay them bare, right? Here's another contrast that Daston and Galison make between sort of truth to nature, sort of older school picture of a skeleton, and then a more modern one. This is still early from the second one is from the 1930s here, where, right, you can see the picture is sort of off in the center and stuff. There's different ways to be objective, and they have a third one that they want to talk about, which is this trained judgment sometimes, which I think might be more what we're doing in some of these pictures, which is something like so here's the image. It's not just hands off, but also you need to know what's going on to even know what's happening in the image. So for example, this kind of picture is like a bubble chamber, right? Like a gas chamber kind of image of from particle physics, right? And in order to know what's going on, in order to make the discovery, you already have to know what sort of patterns to expect. I don't, right? But when this image was a big important one in the discovery of a certain type of particle, they took a picture exactly at the right moment to show that something new was happening, off pattern from all of the other things. Here's one I just picked up. This is a Landsat image, I think of LA, and somehow it also is a picture of vegetation, right? That somehow there's a vegetation somehow represented by how much red is in each little square, if I'm understanding this right. I don't mean to derail the conversation too much, but I did want to kind of do a different version of stepping back and asking these same questions about, like, what is this thing that you guys have made, right? Is it, what are we doing with each of these pictures? I like these questions about what does it mean to draw on pictures from the canon, and what type of observer does it make us if we're going to pick the images that we pick, right? That's the That's the question that Daston and Gallison want to ask of the scientists,
Mhm.
right? How does each virtue relate to a certain type of being a scientist? And I know we're not trying to be scientists here, right? So this is sort of a big metaphor. But before I run out of time, I'm going to pick up my kids soon.
No,
I just
it's
want to
totally.
pop in with these thoughts about, what is this tool that you've made? It's
Well, if I see this material, I'd say a lot of this is still on the mimetic level. It's trying to depict, it's trying to find better representation, either by X-ray or cartography or diagram or mixture of images, but it's still on the level of collecting, interpreting, and recording. There's, on the other hand, there's also something like mood boards and all types of boards that writers use and designers that are not like recording, but they're more like productive. And some of them are pretty awful. There's storyboards, and I think in that sense we're closer to a board than to an atlas in that sense. But we are using like little bits of recording in the sense that, okay, we use images, but I think what's different than, let's say, a table where you say, okay, you have a book, which is a page, either horizontal or vertical, or rectangle, and you sort of collect and organize material. You see the same with Aby Warburg, and you put the name nymph, and then you get a sort of bunch of nymphs, and you argue about pathos formal and nachleben and whatever. But that's sort of part of a larger construct. But it's not productive yet as a machine. And I think that the idea of a board is always more like that you organize material in a way that it can produce other things outside of the board, right? So I think in that sense we're still like close to designers when we start to say, okay, let's not depict the figure, let's not depict a bunch of floating figures or a bunch of stuff. Or, I mean, we could have done that as well, make pages of figures in contrapposto or figures of divers or figures of floating figures or whatever. And that's not what we did. We were more like interested in this motor and this mechanics. So that's not mechanical objectivity, but it's sort of a mechanics of generating, because it tries to understand this figure as something that produces. And it's not just like a repetition of the same, like a symbol or a concept. So in that sense, but how it's actually situated and how it would dress up when it's situated, I guess you would then have to go to representational material. So that's what I'm thinking, like if to properly depict, and I'm myself, I'm not so sure if you can actually show figures. Yes, or like showing radiance, that's. But I do think it's a board is something else than an atlas, and I do think we're sort of hybridizing. It sounds awful to use this word "sort of" all the time, but it's. I do think we are flipping back and forth between a board and an atlas and a chart and a diagram. What I was worried about is like I was like very surprised by the shape of the figures and the internal coherence as a motor, but I was like much more worried about how they would align. I would like think of figures as something that's on a shelf, it's like a different bunch of figures, like porcelain figures. And that you could change their order and like make up stories and whatever. And now they're sort of quite fixed in their position. It's like looking at the genealogical tree of the Greek pantheon or something. They're very clearly aligned and structured, more conceptually than in the sense of time. But I use the word atlas, and I also thinking of gravity, which is important in this whole construct. Is there weight involved with images? So we're interested in that as well. But I do see we're.
Well, and I think maybe part of it is the interdisciplinarity of it, right? As a viewer, of this so far in the process up until today, right? And maybe because this sort of, I've participated in this sort of board work before with designers, but I had really been conceiving of part of, I've just been trying to follow along, right? So I've been seeing these presentations as, take for example, Hyrie's choice to use Doctor Who, right? So there's this moment where he chose some specific images, and I was able to follow along in some moments, to try to get on the same wavelength, right? It's interesting because I wasn't conceiving of myself as someone on the inside, right? Oh, here we are all in the sandbox doing this board together, but instead I was conceiving of myself as a audience member, right? Here's the set of images, and can I understand, can I learn what each developer of each of these arms, of each of these figures is thinking, and in that sense, right, then at that moment, right, rather than a collaborator, right, who's also working on the board, but in that moment of can I follow along as an audience member? I've been thinking the whole time in those terms of like, all right, well, what goes into the choice of each image on this board? What is the sort of situatedness of that? Can I make a connection there? What is the implications of each choice rather than another choice, right?
There's a whole background to this.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of lectures. There's a whole structure to the seminar, which I haven't presented on purpose, right? Why? Because I don't want the figures to be representative of a theory or a figurology or whatever. What I'm interested in, are they convincing in a certain way? And if they are convincing, in what way? And is there any rigor to it? Or have we just been doing stuff which we're accidentally good at or not, right? So that I think that's a major question. I think because a lot of the actors are pursuing PhDs, and also a lot of in the chorus in the audience are pursuing PhDs, and I'm interested in if you actually want to work with figures, how do you find rigor? Because they're very different than concepts or theoretical constructs, or for Michel Serres, it would be very difficult to have a bunch of PhDs and write proper rigorous thesis, right, as expertise, as a form of expertise. And though I'm stunned by the work, I'm also a bit shocked by it, because it's very difficult to measure the jumps. And I'm thinking like, okay, if there would be a device, if I can actually, instead of just naming a figure like Harlequin or whatever, and then just come up with a bunch of associations, can I actually construct it? And I think that's the point where we get to like literary sources and the canon, and because there is expertise there. And not in the sense of authority, because we're not explaining ideal figures through the notion of the idea and the form being as an expressive mechanism of the idea. Not at all. We're interested in postures, right? So that it does use all those images, and it does acknowledge that they're there for a reason. That's why we like to talk about beauty and mimesis, but in a sort of totally oblique way. I don't think that's a vernacular, by the way, in an oblique way, and always in a way that sort of loops things back on themselves, right? Not give them a sort of an external exoskeleton. I think that would be sort of an answer, But I've invited you guys because I never expected this atlas to actually become a board, or this board to become an atlas. right? So I need expertise from the outside to actually look at this, because I understand these machines as separate entities, but to actually see them link up sort of worries me. So I would like to know what kind of map this is, if I want to proceed with this type of seminar. That's the subtext, obviously. Because if there's no rigor to it, you can just forget it, right? It's just fake research. It's just helping students to just, record their readings and present them in a way they don't have to write papers about it.
But this is very complicated to say something to that, because the whole seminar is, I mean, there is another aspect. I didn't, unfortunately, have time to follow the seminar, but you totally set up a dramatic structure, no? So yeah. Quite a classical theatrical site. So that means everybody who is there is about to play along. So then to ask, is there some autonomy in what shows up? For me, it's complicated to ask, because it has been preset to a large amount, no? And to which amount exactly, I don't know. I haven't been part, but there is it's a bit the same problem like when we try to address the canon in another way, even if it's an oblique way. It's still the canon presets what it will resonate to, no? When we ask questions, even if we twist those questions. So that's why I was mentioning, for me, the Dante's Convivio is very important, no? So because it kind of gives the reality of what it means for a vernacular to evolve, no? And a vernacular that is written, not just dialects of idiosyncratic communal forms, but actually with a syntax, with a grammar, with a generality.
Sure. But don't you think there can be a vernacular of images? I mean, images rhyme, images link up.
Yeah,
images
sure they can.
So there's a vernacular of images here as well, no?
But that's what I was, yeah. So a lot of the representations were iconic ones. No. So could this idea of the torso, which cannot stand on itself, and which is to kind of bring to the table this notion of masculinity, can we make it be here differently than by the direct iconic image? And that doesn't need to be words, that this can be.
I think we did that, by linking that image directly to the image, that it's reversed, that it's lying flat on the ground instead of standing on a pedestal with its prosthesis linked to it. So it becomes an image of weakness.
But I'm sorry, I can't say it clearly. That's not what I mean with the vernacular. So that's more. It's also not a critique at all. It was very interesting. It's just when you ask, is there an autonomy to the figures linking up and taking contour? There is a preset with the theatrical setup of the structure of the seminar, which I find really interesting. No? So that's also not a critique. It's just something that would have to kind of be factored in. And that's again interesting. How do we do that? Because it's like also the reference that you, Robert, brought up with the objectivity. So then there's a kind of a parallel world where you have this objectivity, you always have the problem with the laboratory setup. So what happens if you turn the laboratory into a site of action and of drama and of symbolism and so on, and of a kind of a literary co-presence? I find these things very interesting, and perhaps there is something chiastically to be found as well at that point, with regard to a notion of rigor in relation to the figure. Yeah, more the figure than the figurative, obviously.
Yeah, we were planning one more, to be honest. I'm not sure if you guys can survive another one.
Unfortunately, I actually have to run.
I
I'm
understand.
holding out to the last possible minute, but I do have to leave.
No, I understand. Also, like it's late in Europe. Just a short one. Are you still alive or not?
Yeah, I'm still alive.
Because for Juzar, it's we're like really middle of the night. Right? Juzar is in India. And what is it, 10 hours away from us? I really would like to show that because Juzar has been working with crosses instead of rectangles and loops.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. Okay. Yeah, was working on the question of what is a figure. And over here, I will start with Aglaia. With Aglaia, we are grappling with the shining figure. Questions like how do things acquire that shining quality, otherwise called vaghezza or charm by Firenzuola, need to be discussed. There's a certain je ne sais quoi about shining. One cannot say whether it is this part or that part that shines. This shining is a blurred sort of shining that has a blurring effect, or blurring that has a shining effect. This phenomena of blurring brings us to the question of indeterminacy of shining itself. On the right, you have the blur that shines, as in diamonds, faceted in a way as to blur out the edges. Blur that results from a gradual change as in the color of flowers, or the sfumato technique of Leonardo to make the figures glow, or the blurry shine, that indeterminate glow on the face of Greta Garbo in the film Queen Christina. Blur resulting from the technique of subtle variation. The figure of Aphrodite, which is at the top, is all about this blurry shine. She is made of foam. Isn't it telling? She is the transfiguration of the sea itself. It is the way the sea appears to itself, foamy, wavy. Shining blur, on the other hand, is all about the surplus of appearances, blurring of consciousness that results from the excess of visibility, like the stroboscopic image of on the left. There is an image of the face, so a blurred that actually shines, and there is a lot in it. There is always more to say in it. There is a thickness of visibility. This excess becomes part of the everyday exchange relation of images between things. This exchange of appearances brings us to the figures of three graces, Aglaia, Euphrosyne, and Thalia. Aglaia means shining. When a thing is at the stage of giving out or handing out appearances, it shines as Aglaia. Euphrosyne appears at a receiving stage, at the stage of absorbing images. She is also the figure of deep mirror. And Thalia appears as bloom at the returning stage. A plant's way of saying thank you to the sun. The three figures are always together, dancing hand in hand, forming a perpetual cycle. It creates a cycle because of asymmetric exchange between the three. Gift appears as more than what it is. The receiver is overwhelmed by it, and the return of gift will always be lesser than what was received. The cycle of gift takes on the figure of Harris. Aglaia, Euphrosyne, Thalia, Harris. Are they one or many? Again, a shining blur. If you can move at the top. The two attributes or qualities of a figure, that of shiny blur and blurry shine, transfigures as Aphrodite on one end and Harris on other end of the vertical axis. This vertical axis is also the axis of transfiguration, where the figure jumps from being itself to become the other. While Aphrodite is about singularity appearing as many, Harris is about multiplicity appearing as one. Although we see images, but a thing, or better, a figure shines. Shining appearances are not the same as images of shining things. Appearances are blurred, but images are sharp. So how is that possible? For Hume, things are bundles of images, but with Aglaia, all the images we see and all the images we can see are mixed, shredded, and transformed into a blur. A blur you cannot see. You can't see that too much of or the surplus. That's why we experience it as indeterminate. How do figures manage that? Well, by using their axial structure to mix the images. The images on one side are mixed with those on the other, and that goes for both axes. The structure of the cross-potent is like a heavy-duty blender. Okay, if you can zoom out and move towards Nataraja below. Yeah. Shining is produced by movement that blurs the edge of the figure. This brings us to the figure of movement itself, that of Nataraja. Excess of vision presupposes excess of mobility. Nataraja, being a cosmic dancer, is a highly postural figure. Moving from one posture to another, it creates a garland of rhythms. When all postural rhythms are superimposed, you find that the figure has turned spectral. It has acquired many arms, and these arms create a halo around it. If you can move right, Harry, and have that image of the horse. Yeah. This is the image of, on the left, the image of the horse. And the other images. These are almost like stroboscopic sculptures, actually, where different postures are superimposed on top of the other, and then you have this excess of limbs or excess of arms in it. These are other experiments which are in superimposition, and yeah, that's it. But it's difficult to actually say whether a figure or a thing is moving or being moved, or whether it is still. It creates a sort of a spectrality. Okay, from here we move on to the octopus, the figure of the octopus. Excess of mobility needs an excess of limbs. The reason why octopi are so good at deception is that they understand the limbs as instruments to create appearances and not just to grab things. It is a magical dexterity. The figure of octopus shines and flickers between appearances. It appears here as a rock, there as a snake. Is it an uprooted plant or the hand cut loose? Being always in touch with water, the figure is autoerotic. It is always in touch with itself. It can grasp the sea. It knows that the sea is also indeterminate. Its touch is as soft as its grasp is tight. On the top, you have the figure, the octopus appearing as the autoerotic attribute of it. On one hand, it appears in the dream of a fisherwoman, caressing her, arousing ecstasy in her. On the other, it appears in the terrorizing vision of a Norwegian sailor as a sea monster raising a storm, which is at the below, the kraken monster. With octopus, movement acquires matiz. The figure not only moves, but moves in cunningness. This figure is a shape shifter. Its weakness allows it to become the other. Its many limbs in movement begin to take on a blur that can take on different images. Octopus is the figure of blur itself. If you can zoom out, Harry. So what does these figures of Aglaia, Nataraja, and Octopus tell us about the figure in general? It tells us that the figure in movement creates an excess of visibility, excess that creates around the figure a halo of indeterminacy. Yeah, that's it from my side. Yeah,
Can we zoom out a bit? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we zoom out more? I'd like to see all three. Is that possible? You're the first to use cross-like figures, which is quite surprising. because we earlier had like fourfolds that people filled in quadrants, but never like on the cross itself. And so on the sense of a motor, I'd say the cross is a very interesting figure because it's you have to imagine it moving. That means that there must be an exchange from between poles, as well as between the poles of different axes. And there's also a question of asymmetries. So you didn't try to so the figure is sort of initially symmetrical, but then you sort of try to build and give weight to different parts, which I find really interesting because talking about the canon, you know, the Aglaia has the vertical axis is totally within the framework of art history. And then the horizontal is quite awkward. Can you explain how that works?
I think on the horizontal axis is more about it's more of actually a technological argument in the sense of how the shining blur comes about or the blurry shine comes about. And the vertical is more about the phenomenological argument which the images which we see as figures, basically, not figures per se, but we can only see, we can only have images of figures, but the real figure isn't determinate. No, the edges blur out, so it's actually difficult to make out what what is it.
Can we scroll a bit down, Hyrie, so we can see the top? No, scroll up, please. So we can see the whole of Aglaia, please. Yeah, stop. Okay, so.
And because the horizontal transfigures into the vertical, so that's how the shiny blur becomes takes on the form of Aphrodite. And,
yes, but it's already on that vertical axis. There's a huge transformation going on. So we got a single figure. We got a single figure at the top, which is a radiant figure, and then suddenly that figure is in a movement with two others, and they seem to split. So what's interesting is you get both a Botticelli at the top and the bottom. So at the bottom, basically Aglaia is Aphrodite. And she's moved by the wind, and at the bottom Aphrodite is clothed, but she's in the middle, and then the three graces, which has Aglaia in it, are dancing around, right? So there's this relationship of standstill and being moved. So there's a whole set of transformations here. Now, how does that work with that technological axis? How you call it the technological axis, right? Charm. So, how is that technological charm?
Say in the sense that it is how the figure works actually. Or how does these figures or a figure in general has these attributes of shining and blurring? How come they have it?
So what I'm interested in is like that horizontal axis exactly sort of intersects where Aglaia is all alone and where there's the name. So that must mean something so technologically, there's a production of a certain type of images that are blurred or faceted or radial or overlapping. There's a whole set of techniques. But those techniques do not apply, so that intersection is not lower, right? So I'm asking myself, at what point does that dancing, if they're dancing around, at what point does that become an appearance or a blur? That is your argument, or? This cross-potent is a very interesting figure, because you get these heavy arms that are like loaded with images.
Can I ask something?
Sure.
Are you looking for a kind of almost a combination of divination and rigor with the figures? Because then what would be kind of, when I hear you describe what you see in this figure, so you are coding it, no? You say, okay, it's important, and these are, so you change the scales you describe, you give indexes of what you see in this figure, and this codes it in a certain way. And from this coding, you can, of course, extract a measure. So you can extract something metrical. But also there are different ways of how you could do that, which was actually even the case with the human figure as the canon, no? Whether you take, which one do you take as a basic unit and so on. So, but I get the feeling that this is not what you're looking for. Can you maybe say more on the significance of the shapes, or because how you think of it, because it shouldn't be a reading of it, right, in your understanding.
That's for you, Juzar.
No, I'm thinking about
Well,
it.
it's to the studio, I guess.
I'm still trying to understand the question. So,
There's a whole set of statements here about what blurring actually is, and because it means that I mean this whole thing about radiance. We had Lucy, and we now get Aglaia, which means shining, which is a close to notions that we, for instance, like the aura, where things start to look at you. So there's a part of consciousness that's on the side of things, and that has a highly aesthetic effect because of this surplus, right? So there's a sense of that your own perception falls short, right? So you're overwhelmed by what you're seeing, and you can actually construct that technologically. The other thing is that, yes, this is a figure that can be understood on itself. That's that whole sort of top arm. But the lower arm actually says that this form of shining is a gift, and that involves movement, right? So there's this notion of giving. Aglaia is one of the three graces, so that's giving, receiving, and thanking. So there must be an overlap between, and let's say that, because if you're overwhelmed by something, when there's a surplus, that's not necessarily a gift, right? So you have to be careful with how much. Is there any proper theory in India about the number of limbs for each of the gods?
Uh, I don't know much about it, but in terms of iconography, while making images, there is a canon which says about how to make a certain god in a certain way.
Can we scroll down, Hairi? These stroboscopic images are quite interesting if you compare them directly to these images of the gods. What type of gods are those on the right?
One is Durga, so generally mother goddess. Then, in fact, most of them are such. And on the right bottom, you have Tibetan goddesses of Buddhism, basically. The radiant blurb that you see at the back of it, the radiant halo, they are actually hands, 1,000 hands, 1,000-armed goddess. So that is how it actually creates that blur. It is almost similar to the limbs of the octopus. When in motion, it actually creates a blur around it of limbs, and there's actually an axis which actually talks about the axis of mobility and mobility of appearances, mobility of images from one to the other, and this thing becoming the other becoming this thing, not completely because they are always sharing and shedding out their paths. And it was just an image of just a thing. If I take my images from the daily appearance or of maybe maybe 20 photographs of a day, my own images, and I put one on top of the other, then I have a very different feel of myself. In that sense, it's actually about excess. It's actually about surplus and abundance of appearances, which resides in the things themselves. So,
that's quite different than the images of the dancing women, because these are stills. And now I don't know exactly how in India there's a dance. It's not a continuous movement. It's a set of postures, right?
it goes from posture to posture, but
Yeah.
some pundits also say that maybe it's wrong to see it as postures to postures, but it's a movement turning into a standstill and becoming a posture. Then again, so it's a sort of a circle or a cycle between stillness and movement. But of course, it's more about postures.
Now that radiance is sort of this circle, right? So that's a very neutral figure. It's a radial figure. So you get all those arms in all directions, which shows a sort of a co-presence of all kinds of moments that are possible of movement, right? And that turns into appearance, almost like potential becoming visible. But those singular postures are not your typical neutral positions, right? They're very
They are charged.
they're very hooked and very so I'm wondering how those postures relate to those sort of generalized postures that almost like become wings and like disc-like halos. Well, the postures of the dancers are quite extreme. I'm thinking of yoga too. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with yoga, but the postures of yoga is even more extreme. Right? Very, very hooked and architectural. And I'm trying to understand what those postures are. They're very, very exact, all the way to the soles of the feet and the tips of the fingers, where we see on the left, and sort of that, what is that, tree nymph, which are, I mean, contrapposto in the Greek sense has nothing compared to the Indian contrapposto, right? I mean, the internal contortions and serpentines are quite different. So what are these postures that we see on the horizontal there on the left?
All these postures are actually it's almost like if you imagine the extremities of our bodies, the palms and the feet actually developing or directing the posture of the body itself. So the way you move your feet and the way you move your hands actually determine the shape the posture will have. So and all these postures, all these foot movements are actually coded. So you move from one movement to other movement and third movement, and even the hand, which is actually the part of appearances, because hands are always making gestures and portraying a story or telling a narrative. It's a form of storytelling. Now, dance is actually a form of storytelling. So the movement, the foot movement is actually about the polyrhythmic space, while the hand movements are about polychromatic objects of contours, of colors. And when they work independently also, that's why there is also a twist at the hip. And the twist is so much that the hip almost becomes invisible, as if the two halves are working independently, yet they are in continuity because it's part of one movement still. So and all these figures are actually breaking away from the tree. They are actually tree nymphs. They are actually breaking out from the tree and actually celebrating the occasion of fruition, or abundance. Again, abundance. They are all dancing. Dancing as if because the foot and the hands are independent also. They actually pursue their own things.
I'm trying to understand like this circular halo and these circular figures. You know, when you sort of multiply all the possible positions, and I'm trying to sort of link that to these extreme postures that don't seem to have a middle. Right, so we get like a flower, we know the middle out, it's a radiant figure, but here it seems like the feet and the hands are almost independent of each other, and the poor hip needs to like relocate or manage in between, but it's never in the middle. It's never in the middle. So there's a shaking of the hip that needs to sort of manage between these very complex figures of the feet and the hands that seem to like do something completely different from each other. So I think it's like incredibly interesting, but also a contrast with those circular. I mean, from a Western point of view, we get the middle, we know the circle of Leonardo. Where's the man? And it's the navel's in the middle. Well, it's actually not, it's the genitals in the middle. And here there seems to be no middle.
In fact, you can also say it as a search for the middle, because a figure stabilizes itself in movement, in motion. So the figure is actually doesn't have a choice but to move and keep on dancing. Actually, no. So
yeah, I think that's important to say, that they're all standing. They're not freeze frames of movements, right? They're very stable positions. Okay, guys. Let's see how many are. I just want to thank everybody. That was long. Much longer than I promised. Thank you, Vera. I have to apologize. That's a new record again. Thank you, Rick, for helping us out. We have a lot to think about for next week to conclude our seminar. This was quite extreme. We tried to sort of figure out what figures are and what the motors are in the machines and how they would sort of map and link to each other. I think we got a few new clues of how we're proceeding and how we're going to do this. I think that's it for everybody. Thank you very much. I'll see everybody next week. And I just want to thank Rick, Vera, and Robert again for their participation.
Thanks from my side as well. It was very interesting.
All too. Great.
Thank you.